Today we are going to dive into the diaphragm, one of the biggest muscles that you have in your body that you may or may not know about. It cuts you in half. Right here is your breathing muscle, and it is really one of the most important muscles in your body. It is always working, or almost always working, and it better be working or you will not be here for very long. So let's get into it. We are going to dive into the diaphragm in a lot of detail today. We're going to talk about it from both an anatomy perspective, where it is, what it does, where it attaches, but also sort of what it does functionally, how it relates to everything around it, and also how it relates to the different systems in your body. We're also going to look at it through the lens of 3 different books. I want to show you some pictures of it, and we'll talk about how it works in your body, how it functions well, and sometimes how it doesn't function as well, and how it may be, if it is not functioning as well, causing some of the problems that you might be experiencing, such as back pain, shoulder pain, neck pain, and then what we can do about it, both through massage and potentially other modalities such as PT and acupuncture. All right, great, let's get into it. So, what is the diaphragm? For those of you who haven't heard that term before, it is your main breathing muscle. Again, it is located underneath your lungs, at the bottom of your rib cage. Your heart and lungs sit on top of it. Your viscera or main digestive organs sit below it, and it basically has 2 halves to it, even though it's basically one muscle. It connects to all of the bottom of your low ribs, but it does have what's called a central tendon that doesn't cut it in half completely, but it does make it function a little bit like 2 halves. They don't really function separately. You can't just breathe with one side, but it does make the 2 sides have somewhat of a little bit of a difference to them. And we'll talk a little bit about how that shows up from the 2 sides and how they can function slightly differently from each other, and also how they are often in people slightly asymmetrical from each other. And let's talk a little bit about that asymmetry, right? Because when we look at the human body from the outside, most of us, not all of us, look largely symmetrical from the outside. 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 2 ears. On the inside, that is really not true at all. On the inside, we are very asymmetrical. So above the diaphragm, we have on the left side the heart and 2 lobes of lung. On the right side, the heart is not there, although the heart isn't fully on the left. It sits sort of slightly off to the left, not just fully off. And on the right side, there are 3 lobes of lung on the right lung. So the 2 lungs are not the same. The right lung has 3 compartments, the left lung has 2. And so the diaphragm actually is slightly thicker on the right side than the left side. Below the diaphragm, you've got a very asymmetrical picture. So just going from left to right, if I can remember exactly what's going on, you've got stomach and spleen, so spleen, stomach, and then you've got gallbladder, liver on the right side. And then below that, you've got the large intestine that wraps all the way up and around. And then below that, down in this space, you've got the small intestine. And then below that, you've got the bladder. All right, and the small intestine is this big giant coil of just mess, basically, of tubing. The large intestine is a thicker tubing that all of the food goes through. And then the stomach, spleen, stomach, gallbladder, liver, and then behind here you've got the kidneys on the back. Those are all differently shaped organs. The kidneys are the same on both sides, but each of the other organs are differently shaped. And roughly on most humans, those are going to be roughly in the same places from human to human, but not always in the exact same places, and can shift around from human to human depending on injuries or genetics or how they grow up or various things. You see on charts, they look like there's these big open spaces, and they draw them that way so that you can get an idea what they look like and what the shapes of them are. But the truth is, nature abhors a vacuum, and there really is no empty spaces in the body. Any empty spaces are going to be filled in with fascia or fat. And there's some stuff called visceral fat that fills in all of the empty spaces in your body, in your viscera. That's why it's called viscera fat. So you wouldn't have a vacuum of space in there in between all of that stuff, right? Because then it would just get filled in. Okay, so that's basically the structure of everything above and below the diaphragm. A couple of things to note that are somewhat important in how they affect the diaphragm. On the right side, the liver, which is quite large, I actually, just a side tangential story, had to take, well, I didn't have to, there was an option to take a cadaver lab when I was in massage school 18 years ago, which was given at a chiropractic college, which meant that you put on lab coats and went down into the cold room and everything smelled like formaldehyde. And we didn't get to, cut anything open or anything like that, but we got to see the parts and were shown around. And one of the doctors actually just pulled out a liver and handed it to me, and it's quite heavy. They weigh about 3 to 4 pounds, and it's like, it's not a light thing, and they're big. So it doesn't just sit in your cavity, because if it were just sitting there, eventually it would sink all the way down your guts and drop to the bottom. So it needs something to support it, so it will attach to your diaphragm and hang off of your diaphragm on the right side by a ligament. And that will affect the diaphragm on the right side and make the right side diaphragm thicker as a muscle, which theoretically will affect the right side of the body tissues and maybe make the right side musculature pull into itself a little bit more, but that's a theory, don't quote me on that. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some idea of this musculature. Now, I've done a lot of air drawing with my hands to give you an idea of this structure. Let's actually try to give you some visuals to look at it. So we've got an overhead camera here. I'm going to pull open these books so you can get a general idea of what this is. And it's still hard to see what a three-dimensional thing looks like on two-dimensional drawings, but these books have some really good drawings in them. So let's take a quick look. So this Trail Guide to the Body is a really great book. This is actually my copy from massage school. I've had it for 18 years plus at this point. It's obviously pretty earmarked and mangled from 18 years of use, but it is a really great text to learn basic bones and muscles from. And if you're ever interested in learning anatomy, this is a really great place to start for even a layperson. So I've marked out the page with the diaphragm on it, and we've got the overhead camera here, so I'm going to pull these books aside. And here we go. I'm going to rip that off, toss it. Sorry, sticky pages. All right. So here we go. This is a decent rendering of the diaphragm because I drew it as if it's horizontally cutting you in half, but in fact, it's more shaped like that, with the back side being much lower in space and the front side being much higher in space, sort of like this, right? So this is your xiphoid process. This is the top of your lumbar, and those two things are, the front side of your body is this finger, the back side is this finger. They're much different heights. And so it isn't really a question of the whole thing going like, it's more like this, right? Weird sound, but that's not, and your diaphragm doesn't talk to you, but that's basically how this works. The idea of it is that it creates a vacuum in your lungs. So the diaphragm will contract downwards and really more like towards your front and down. And that creates a vacuum in your lungs. And the vacuum pulls the air in from the outside because nature abhors a vacuum. Now, I always teach this when I'm teaching my rib cage class. When I teach, we have a myofascial release for the rib cage that I teach massage therapists coming up in the fall. I teach it once or twice a year, links below in case you're interested. When I teach that class, I talk about the idea that unlike certain things in the body like bicep or tricep, bicep, where you've got an agonist-antagonist relationship where one muscle does one thing, then the other muscle does the other thing, we tend to talk about breathing as inhale, exhale, as one muscle inhaling, one muscle exhaling. It's not really what happens. We have the diaphragm inhaling, and really when we exhale, all we need to do is let go of the inhale to have a purest, the most easy version of breathing. So at its most relaxed form, when we're just chilling out, lying down, not trying to hide from the dinosaur or hunt for food, all you need to do is take the action of firing the muscle to inhale. So breathe in, that looks like the diaphragm firing down and forward. And then you just let that muscle go, and all of that bounces out. The compression of your ribs inflating like that lets go, and the air just releases. And so the action is the inhale. Exhaling is just a release of that action at its purest. So I really want to sort of drive that home, that the inhale is the action and the exhale is just a release of that action, and that you're not actually doing anything to exhale, or you shouldn't have to do anything to exhale unless you're trying to hide from a dinosaur, which we can joke about and talk about. But if you've all seen that classic scene in Jurassic Park when she's in the kitchen hiding from the velociraptor and she's got to make no sound and make no movement because they're all tracking movement to try to find things, that's when you need to try to force the breath to move different ways, and you're actually trying to. And that's a different kind of breathing where you can actually make an action out of the exhale, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So just looking at this is compressing down and then releasing, compressing down and then releasing. This image down here, if you really want to get, this is actually from underneath the diaphragm. So we're now looking down from underneath it. These little fingers here are what's called the crura of the diaphragm. Do they have that labeled? They don't have that labeled. That's too bad. They'll have it labeled on some other image of the diaphragm, but they are the crura, and they attach as far down as L2 on some people, but at least as far down as L3 on the front bodies of the lumbar vertebra. There is also going to be a hole in the diaphragm where the vena cava, which is the main vein that your blood comes back up through the legs, goes back up through. And there's going to be a hole for the aorta, which is the main pathway for the blood to come down through the heart comes through. And there's going to be a hole here for the esophagus to come down through, because otherwise nothing could happen and the whole thing would just block anything from coming from the top of your body down to the bottom of your body. So it's not just a big pure muscle with no hole. It's got to have some holes in it for this stuff to come in and out through it. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some clarity. Now the other thing you can see here is that there's all these attachments to the ribs all the way around here, and these attachments coming up in the back to the lumbar spine, and around in here it weaves into quadratus lumborum, if you know what that is. Here's the QL muscle, if you've heard of that. Here's psoas major, if you've heard of that at all. We can talk a little bit more about that as well. And then there's this central tendon, which we can talk about a little bit more. But in any case, this giant thing of muscle, and again, I like to remind everybody, this is a very big muscle in your body. So it's very important. Okay, so there's kind of the main overview. Let's get a little bit more detail. So let's first go to Ida Rolf's book, Rolfing. She is the master guru. I love this image because it gives you some really cool overviews of how diaphragm can interplay with psoas, QL, iliacus, and a few other muscles. I love throwing those Post-its. Okay. And I love this book because it's got these drawings that are hyper detailed over here and really technical, but also these cool drawings that are a lot more simplified, so you can kind of get the best of both worlds. You can really see things when they need to be simplified and see things when they need to be detailed. So here, up here, we have this idea of the diaphragm arcing over the top of and connecting everything down, and these crura coming down. Here we do have a label, thankfully. On here you can see it coming down to about L2, maybe L3. Some people it can even go down to L4. And then we have all these attachments that will weave fascially into quadratus lumborum. Psoas major can easily kind of gunk up to it fascially into here. Psoas minor for sure. And then down in here, those can also attach to iliacus. It won't directly attach to it, but they definitely affect each other. Okay, hopefully that makes some sense that they're all interrelated. Great, all right. And then we have Tom Myers' anatomy trains. Now, just so you know, Tom Myers is one of Ida Rolf's inner circle students, studied directly with Ida herself, developed her work into his work, Anatomy Trains, and he teaches something called a structural integration, KSMI, which is sort of an advancement of her work, or a tangential movement of her work, both amazing. And I highly am super influenced by this book and his work, and this is just a fabulous book. So in here, this image is also really excellent, and now we're looking at the diaphragm from the side view. So now we're looking more from the side view, which we were looking at in the trail guide book, but now we've got a little color coding where we can see things and get a little bit more view from different angles. So again, we get the idea of how big this muscle is. We get the idea that it's not just a flat horizontal muscle, which we sometimes get it described as, but it's really more of this shape, and that it's more, when it's contracting, it's more doing this than it is doing this, and that it really does interact a lot with QL. And those floating ribs at the bottom, and which QL attaches directly to, those are going to interact a lot. And so if there's restrictions with QL and with back extensors and iliacostalis, one of my faves that nobody talks about, that's going to have a lot of effect on diaphragm, and vice versa. If there's restrictions with diaphragm, or if there is PTSD or anxiety patterns that are affecting how diaphragm is moving, or if diaphragm is stuck in certain patterns that is then making QL stuck in certain patterns, that may affect hips, low back, shoulders, neck, jaw, etc. And so it's really a major player. It's not going to itself often show up as pain, although it can for sure. If there is a history of asthma or bronchitis, or mono, for instance, or COVID, long COVID, absolutely. Even when those things get resolved, the patterns that those build up of restricted breathing or fear around restricted breathing or fear around freedom of breathing, those patterns can then build up into long chain restriction around things that then will lead to shoulder pain or back pain or neck pain or jaw clenching, TMJ, or it can even travel down into the hips, legs, knees, feet, toes even, hands, elbows, wrists. It can really affect a lot. And so there really isn't a client who gets on my table for just about any condition who doesn't get some form of diaphragm release work on my table for anything. There are sessions that I don't do diaphragm release on, but there are very few clients who go through multiple sessions with me where I don't contact diaphragm in some way, shape, or form. It's not that I go after it hardcore, or not that I don't sometimes, but it's just, it would be very rare for me to ignore the diaphragm completely in my work. It just really affects everything. And often it is the unlock for so many things that I could go in circles going over the neck through 5-6 sessions and getting this much results over and over and going in circles, getting better, worse, better, worse, better, worse, but I could spend 3 minutes helping the diaphragm and get this kind of result. And so it really is just kind of that important. So it just doesn't, I just never ever not work on it. Okay, so this is a really fascinating photo here. And I really do, I want to make sure that you understand that none of this is my work here. I want to give credit where credit's due. This is Tom Myers' work. I absolutely am just super influenced by it. And it's not anything new. This is work from decades ago, right? So this is something that only he came up with, as far as I know. He worked decades ago with cutting-edge anatomists and dissectionists. And one of the things that he found, and one of the reasons that his work is called Anatomy Trains, is that what he found was that there were chains of muscles that had fascial lines where the fibers of the muscles all traveled in the same directions in these very long chains throughout the body. And that the integrity of these long chains were such that if you actually removed the chain, and they did this with cadavers, and hung weights off the entire chain, you could hang very heavy weights off of these chains and the muscles didn't break. There was no break in the chain. It had such integrity of form and function that you could hang like 300 pounds off of this chain of muscle and it was perfectly fine. And so here is an example of a chain that he found, which he calls the deep front line, which contains the diaphragm that goes all the way from your toes. This is flexor hallucis longus. This is your big toe, flexor. That's meant to be your toe, not your finger. Up through tibialis posterior, which is the deep back of your calf. Through the deep posterior compartment, which is part of the back of your leg, the back of your knee, up through your deep adductors, which is your inner thigh, through iliacus and psoas, which are your big hip flexors, which psoas and iliacus are becoming very known to the public, especially through YouTube. Through QL, or quadratus lumborum, which again a lot of people are talking about, which then fascially weaves up into the diaphragm, comes up through the front of your spine, fascially, and fascia is the stuff that glues everything together, fascially through your viscera and lungs, up through the front of your cervical spine and out into your tongue. And that entire thing is one long chain, and this is, let's see, I'll make sure I've got it on camera here. This whole thing has fascial integrity through the entire chain. And you can see here the caption says, an early attempt to dissect out the deep front line shows a continual soft tissue connection from the toes via the psoas to the tongue, through the diaphragm. And what that says is that each one of these structures affects anything else along the chain. Meaning, if you've got an issue with your knee, your diaphragm is involved. If you've got an issue with your big toe, the back of your knee is involved, the back of your leg is involved, the psoas is involved, the diaphragm is involved. Any one of those things affects anything else on that chain. So, if you're a body worker, and you're having trouble getting somebody's knee pain to go away, yes, absolutely work on the knee and do that for sure. But if you're doing that cyclically and you're getting somebody to feel better and then they feel worse, feel better and feel worse, feel better and feel worse, try some diaphragm release. That might help that to stick long term. And then the work that you do on the knee might actually feel better and then feel better longer. But don't just do the diaphragm, actually then work on the feet, and then actually work on the adductors, and then actually work on the jaw, because the tongue is part of that whole line too, right? What this model says is that we have to try and get this entire chain to release. Now, it doesn't mean you have to just work on every single fiber of this entire thing. As you start to release parts of this, the whole chain will start to release itself, right? And if you take a look at this model, what's the biggest part of this model? Well, the diaphragm is the biggest muscle here. So that's going to be the unlock for the entire rest of this chain. So if we can start getting that to move better and feel better and breathe more comfortably and more relaxed, which doesn't necessarily mean deeper, because sometimes people think they're breathing more relaxed, but they're actually breathing deeply but very controlled. And I'll show you an example of that. Let me breathe deeply but very, very tensely. That was not very relaxed, was it? Right? Like, you can't. Deep breathing is not always relaxing or relaxed, right? And so what I do with diaphragm relaxation is just try to change the pattern and have it be adaptable, right? Like, we want the breath to adapt to the situation, and we want to have a variety of breathing available to us. If somebody's stressed, we actually want them to be able to right? Like, that's how you respond to something like that is stressful, right? We want to be able to cry. We want to be able to laugh. We want to be able to get angry. Like, those things, we don't want to be able to get stuck in those things forever, but we do want to have like real responses and not just get locked into, I must breathe deeply and slowly at all times, right? That's actually a control pattern. And that will require tension to keep that control locked like a fist all the time, right? And that control of deep breathing all the time will then seep into all of the muscles, and you'll be just deeply breathing, but like this all the time. So, a lot of the work that I will do will be to try to lighten that up and give you more options. Maybe you breathe a little faster for a little while and then a little slower, and then we let it lighten up, and all sorts of different ways, which I actually cover in my rib cage class, mobilizing the rib cage. Again, links down below. But in any case, I don't want to get too deep into that. Just want to really reiterate that if you look at this diagram, any of the places along this chain can be helped by working on that diaphragm, which is the biggest muscle on this whole chain. So hope that makes sense. All right, one last piece of the puzzle here before we close. Couple great images here. Again, thanks, Tom Myers. You're the guru, you're the master. You're not the only master, but you're the master. So this is a front view here. So this is really great, again, to see that the top of the diaphragm is really high in the front, and then the back comes way down and anchors way down on the bodies of the lumbar vertebra. And then here you can really get a sense of just how the holes of the diaphragm have to allow the aorta and the esophagus and the vena cava to pass through, so that you have the ability to pass food and pass blood and nerves and other things down through the muscle, because otherwise your legs wouldn't function and you wouldn't be able to function with the lower half of your body. And so that's just an important thing to realize. The diaphragm needs to have space to allow your legs to function. So hopefully that gives you a lot more context over the diaphragm and a lot more reason to start interacting with it in your work, to remember that it is a really big, giant muscle, to not be so afraid of it. Yes, you have to get up under the ribs to work on it, but that's okay. Yes, there are organs nearby, but you know what? They are protected by a big, giant layer of fascia and big, giant layer of fat. You're not going to suddenly pierce somebody's liver with your fingers. It's totally fine. You're not going to do that. You absolutely won't hurt anybody if you're careful and work slowly, and you look at their face and you contact it and ask them how they're doing. And it's going to be great and very profound and helpful for them if you do this work. So ask any questions you have about the work in the comments below. Love to hear your questions. And hopefully that helps you get some context around the diaphragm. Have a great day.